Some names, they're more than just names, right? They become these huge ideas. And one name, maybe more than any other, has basically become the definition of genius. Albert Einstein.
Seriously, think about it. If I say the word genius, what's the first thing that pops into your mind?
Yeah, for so many of us, it's this face, isn't it? That crazy hair, the twinkle in his eye, Albert Einstein. It's like his name itself means the absolute peak of what a human brain can do.
But what if the story you think you know isn't really the whole story? Because let's be honest, the real person is always way more complex, more, well, human, and just flat out more interesting than the legend. So today we're going to peel back those layers and find the actual man behind the myth.
All right, so let's start with the legend itself. How does a person become that big of an icon? Okay, so it really kicks off in 1905. It's known as his miracle year. And get this, he's just a 26-year-old guy working a pretty boring day job. But in that one summer, he drops 4 papers that don't just nudge science along, they completely blow up our whole understanding of space, time, the universe, everything. I mean, it was this incredible burst of creativity, the kind you barely ever see.
But, to really get where that genius came from, we got to go way back. Because the guy who would eventually change our view of the cosmos, he had let's just say, a very surprising start in life.
Can you even imagine? And that wasn't some jealous colleague saying that. No, that was a quote from his own headmaster, talking to Einstein's dad. Talk about a lack of faith, right?
And it wasn't just the grown-ups either. The other kids, they thought he was so weird, they literally called him Brother Boring. He was a total outsider, way more comfortable inside his own head than hanging out with other kids.
And all these little stories from his childhood, they really paint a picture of a mind that was just wired differently. For starters, he didn't even speak until he was 2.5. And when he did, he'd say everything twice. His mom even thought he was a freak because his head seemed too big. And then there's this classic moment that shows you exactly how his brain worked. When his baby sister was born, he looked at her and just asked, "So, where are her wheels?"
So you can probably guess that a mind like this wasn't going to fit neatly into the super strict German school system of the time. And this is where the rebel in him really starts to come out.
He was constantly fighting with his teachers. He absolutely hated the rigid, by-the-book discipline. He felt so trapped, so suffocated that at just 15 years old, he was done. He left. And this wasn't just some kid acting out. This was the beginning of a mind that absolutely refused to be boxed in by what everyone else thought.
He actually had a special word for the kind of people he just couldn't deal with: Philistines. For him, that meant anyone who just didn't have any curiosity or imagination. And he was always on the lookout for other people who felt the same way.
And he found a really important ally in Mileva Maric. I mean, she was a fantastic physics student herself, which was a huge deal back then. Most universities in Europe didn't even let women study. He didn't just see a fellow student in her, he called her his clever creature. He saw a true intellectual equal, someone who could go on this journey with him to figure out how the universe works.
So, you'd think after university, with a mind like that, companies would be banging down his door, right? Nope, not even close. What happened next? Well, it happened in a place you would never, ever expect.
So here he is, 21 years old, with a degree, but he's a total unknown, and he's unemployed. He had to scrape by giving private lessons before he finally got this humble job as a patent clerk in Switzerland.
And this is just perfect. It sums up his whole situation. His day job was looking at other people's gadgets and inventions. But his real work? That was all happening on the down low. He jokingly called his desk drawer his Bureau of Theoretical Physics, because that's where he stashed the very papers that were about to change, well, everything.
And one of the big ideas cooking in that drawer was his special theory of relativity. The core idea, and this is wild, is that things like time and distance aren't set in stone. They're not absolute. He argued they're actually flexible. They can literally stretch and shrink based on how fast you're moving compared to someone else.
And from that theory comes probably the most famous equation of all time. Just 5 little characters, but what they say is huge. That energy and mass are basically 2 different forms of the same thing. They're interchangeable.
Now, if all that sounds a little mind-bending, don't worry. Einstein himself had this amazing way of making it simple. He said, when you sit with a nice girl for 2 hours, it seems like 2 minutes. When you sit on a hot stove for 2 minutes, it seems like 2 hours. That's relativity. It's just brilliant, right? It shows you not only his genius, but his wit and his ability to make these huge ideas feel Understandable.
But, the story doesn't just stop with physics. As Einstein became more and more famous, the world around him was changing in some really scary ways, and he started to realize that his voice, his influence, went way beyond a science lab.
You can really see a huge shift in his life right here. First, he has to flee Nazi Germany and comes to the US. But he couldn't escape what was happening in the world. When he heard that scientists back in Berlin had discovered nuclear fission, he knew he had to do something. He felt this immense responsibility, which is what led him to write that famous letter to President Roosevelt, warning him about the potential for an atomic bomb. Now, that letter helped get the Manhattan Project going, but after the war, seeing the devastation, he was horrified by the very power his own ideas had helped create. And from that point on, he spent the rest of his life fighting for peace and trying to warn the world about the dangers of nuclear weapons.
So, when we look back at it all, who was Albert Einstein, really? The icon, the legend, or the man?
The thing is, he was both. He was that broke, unemployed kid working in a patent office, and he was the global superstar whose face everyone knows. He was the quiet little boy called Brother Boring who grew up to become a citizen of the world, a scientific revolutionary who also developed this incredibly deep sense of social responsibility. What a journey, right?
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Einstein's mind tackled some of the biggest puzzles the universe has to offer. But maybe his story teaches us that the real way to measure a beautiful mind isn't just by the problems it can solve, but by the humanity it chooses to embrace. What do you think?